The wings are to remind us that we're on this cosmic journey. Our planet is moving through space at a rapid rate of speed. In fact, every second that goes by, we've moved 18.5 miles through space relative to the sun. And then the sun, in turn, of course, is moving relative to the galactic center. And in fact, as some occult traditions would have us believe, there's actually a subgalactic center that our solar system is orbiting, which is in turn orbiting the galactic center. But in any case, we are moving from some unknown origin to some unknown destiny. And that's what's being symbolized by this winged globe. This represents our world on its cosmic journey. Then we have the dragon. And you'll notice this ferocious dragon, but it's in a position of subordination. See, the human figure here has come to dominate the primordial power of the dragon, has brought it into servitude, has come to show that, that the dragon has become tamed, if you will. Now, the dragon is just a universally rich symbol. It stands for many, many things, but many complementary things. One of the things that the dragon stands for is the telluric current. And as geomancers, I'm sure most of you are familiar with concepts of telluric energy, of energies moving through the earth. But the dragon, you see, has a dual nature. The dragon is not only terrestrial, the dragon is celestial. Dragon generally makes its home within subterranean caverns and layers, but it has wings, which allows it to come up from its subterranean layer and mount up towards the heavens. And that's an important factor in trying to understand this dual nature of the dragon, and that it's simultaneously both terrestrial and celestial. And part of the idea here is that the geomantic currents, or the telluric energies, are ultimately also cosmic energies that have been concentrated into our Earth and have a geometry of motion within our Earth that essentially can be quantified by studying the distribution of the lithosphere. And that gets us into a whole other realm that we hopefully will have time to talk about this afternoon. And that is the fact that the structure of our Earth's crust is very dynamic, especially in our concepts of post-plate tectonics understanding of the way the crust works. But it also appears that the motion of water through the crust of the Earth is governed by the particular geometric pattern of fractures and fault lines within the crust. The pattern of fractures and fault lines in the crust is a function of Earth's interrelationship with the cosmic environment, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the afternoon session. This is a very rich symbol right here. It's one of those that like all symbolism, it's a coherent message. It's just like if we take a jumble of letters and mix them all up and it has no coherent meaning, but then we rearrange those letters, or we rearrange those words in a certain sequence, and suddenly meaning is conveyed. In occult philosophy, the language used to convey meaning is symbolism. And in occult philosophy, the idea is that words no longer are just words. Words are living entities. And words become symbols. Numbers become symbols. Images become symbols. Animals become symbols. Planets become symbols. And the way they're arranged and put together is what conveys the particular meaning. This is a very specific juxtaposition and arrangement of symbols here that conveys a very precise meaning to somebody who's studying the Hermetic traditions. You have a question?
What is the shape of the egg? Did you mention that?
I did mention that it was within an egg. And of course, an egg is a universal symbol having, if you look into many of the ancient traditions from Mithraism, for example, is a good one, where the universe is conceived of being born out of this cosmic egg. And that's what's represented here. There's actually a specific geometry going on here. This is not a true ellipse. It's actually an oval, and it means that there are multiple arcs that have been put together here. Each have their own centers. In my sacred geometry classes, one of the things that I do is we go through one exercise where we learn to draw a whole variety of different eggs, each with different proportions and different shapes and so on. He who understands, from China, 2nd century Chinese tomb, he who understands the earth is a wise man, and he who understands the heavens is a sage. Knowledge is derived from the straight line shadow, and that is derived from the right angled joint. The combination of the right angle with numbers is what guides and rules the 10,000 things. Now, the basic right angle joint can be had simply with this, a compass and a level. And when I set this up perfectly, I've got this is the Tau cross, and it creates a right angle joint. I can also, if I've got a level surface on the ground, I do the plumb bob and I've got a right angle joint there. If this was a vertical pole, you see then what it says here, the straight line shadow. So depending on where I am on the earth is going to determine the particular geometries of this shadow. If I'm at 35, I think we're about 35 degrees north latitude here roughly. So that's going to have a different set of angular relationships than if we were at 45 degrees north latitude or at 25 degrees north latitude or at 15 degrees south latitude. So what happens is by setting this vertical pole in the ground, we create a series of shadows which are unique to our position on the surface of the earth. That was the first act of the ancient temple builders, was setting that vertical pole in the earth in order to cast those shadows and generate the unique geometries, the geometries that were geodetically unique to that spot. And here we see Borneo tribesmen doing exactly that. Here's the pole, here's the straight line shadow. You can't probably tell here, they're actually inserting little sticks in the ground to mark that shadow. And that shadow will be marked through the course of one day. And by tracking the course of the shadow through one day, you can get an exact east-west bearing. In the course of a day, what will happen, if you can picture this, I'm not sure what time of day this is, but let's assume it's morning, about mid-morning, and the sun is up here. And this is Borneo, so actually everything's going to be reversed. But if this was in the northern hemisphere, the sun would be in the south, would be in the southeast in the morning, and it's going to arc over, and as it moves over to this side, the shadow is going to swing around like this. Can you picture that? Maybe I can even simulate that here, but yeah, you can picture that the shadow will swing around like this, and as the sun rises, of course, the shadow shortens. And then at high noon, the shadow is going to be pointing due north, and then as the sun moves over towards the west in the afternoon and goes lower, it'll go out, it'll grow at the same time. So what's happening is two things are happening to the shadow. It's rotating around like this, and then secondly, it's shrinking throughout the course of the day, and then it elongates again. Now, the idea here is you place if you have a center, any given center, the way it was done in the old days was you had a cord, usually a knotted cord or a chain. For example, if you have a pole, one way it was done, you could have a chain with a ring on the end. The ring slides over the pole, and now you have a way of drawing circles. So if you draw a circle around this pole, what will happen is at some time, mid-morning, as that shadow shrinks, the end of the shadow will intersect the circle that you've drawn on the ground. Okay? Then the shadow shrinks, swings around this way, and then it starts elongating again, and at some point in mid-afternoon, it's going to intersect the shadow a second time. Now, if I then take and I put stakes into the ground at those 2 points where the shadow intersects the circle that you've drawn, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, a line connecting those 2 points gives me an almost exact east-west bearing. Okay, and that's the fundamental line. That's our starting line. From that layout of that east-west line, I can use a simple act of geometry and set out an angle a line at right angles to it. In terms of in terms of geometry, I'll show you very briefly how that would work. If our pole, hopefully you can see this, is here, what will happen is the sun, let's say this is the south and this is the north, sun is rising in the southeast, and it goes like this. As it rises in the southeast, the shadow starts out long. At some point during mid-morning, the shadow is going to intersect that circle. As it swings around, the shadow is swinging around as well, and it's also tracing a line that looks like this because it gets short. And then right here would be your exact north-south, where the line is the shortest. And then when you get this point, you can connect these, and there's your east-west bearing right there. Just like that. Does that make sense, sort of? Yeah, it's actually pretty simple. And it works for any latitude. Okay, and then once you've established this east-west line, you use this figure in geometry that's called the Vesica. And what did I do with my pen? There it is. A Vesica is how you get a right angle in geometry. We start with a line, and this could be our east-west line. Okay, once we've established the east-west line, then what we do, we place our compass. Now, instead of a compass, I could be using a sharpened pole with my knotted rope or my chain, and I can simulate any active geometry that I can do with this and this straight edge, I can do in the field with my sharpened pole and my knotted cord. Oftentimes it's referred to as a druid's cord. Okay, so I can then create two circles like this and like this. And where those circles intersect, here and here, I've now created my right angle. In one operation, I've created my right angle 90 degrees, and right here, this angle would be 60, and this angle here is 120. So in one operation, I've created the fundamental angles that I need to then generate any geometric form that I want. This is known as the Vesica. We're going to be seeing it here in a second because it shows up in ancient iconography. Corbusier said, "Behind the wall the gods play. They play with numbers of which the universe is made up." And another alchemical tract showing geometry, its role within the alchemical process. Early on in the Hermetic work, geometry was considered to be crucial because proportion was fundamental for implementing the great work. Without understanding the proper proportions of the primal material, you were doomed to failure. The brick wall represents the Hermetic mystery, and through an active geometry, that mystery can be penetrated. Geometry plays a very important role in all the Hermetic traditions. Scale invariance or mathematical self-similarity. These are modern terms. The ancient terms that they used were stereometry, eurythmy, commodulation. Symmetry in the classical sense is not the same thing as symmetry in the modern sense. Symmetry in the modern sense means, a mirror image on two sides of an axis. Okay, symmetry in the traditional sense meant the division of the whole into parts such that the parts and the whole reflected each other. That's the same definition of dynamic symmetry that J. Hambidge used, and he drew his definition from the archaic definitions. Many poets and mystics and artists, as well as spiritually inclined mathematicians and scientists, have given recognition to this concept of self-similarity through various utterances. Pythagoras said, "You will know, as far as it is allowed to a mortal, that nature is from all points of view similar to itself." This is expressing the idea of mathematical self-similarity. Goethe said that every moment is of infinite value, for it is the representative of a whole eternity. Now here you see the idea applied to the concept of time. Each moment, you see, and this becomes very critical in what we're going to be discussing this afternoon when we're talking about cycles of destruction and catastrophe and so forth, because the greater cycles are merely large-scale reflections of the everyday cycles that we see all the time and are familiar with, just on a larger scale. Sir Thomas Browne, the poet, English poet, said, "There is no man alone, because every man is a microcosm and carries the whole world about him." This is the same concept. Each one of us is a microcosm, embodying all of the fundamental architectural principles of the universe, each one of us. And I just showed you a very simple example of that in terms of your cubit. But it goes much, much further than just that. But the cubit is a good starting point. Lucretius, the Roman poet and philosopher, said, "So far as it goes, a small thing may give analogy of great things and show the tracks of knowledge." Now, we have a certain slice of creation that's available to us, that's perceptible to us, and then there are realms that are outside that. But in the traditional ideas, we can understand those realms that are necessarily outside of our purview of perception by seeing and recognizing that they have analogy in the smaller everyday things. And so there's a relationship between an hour of time and a day of time, between the day of time and a year of time, and the year of time and the precessional cycle. And we're going to talk about that. William Blake said, "To see a world in a grain of sand, a world in a grain of sand. Heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." All of these quotes are kind of expressing the same idea. In the great year, you have an astrological month, also called a Platonic month, and it is to the great year as our lunar month is to our annual year. But more about that as we proceed. Sacred geometry, architecture, and measure. In terms of architectural expressions of sacred geometry, there's probably no finer example than this one right here. Maybe a purer example might be the Great Pyramid. There's probably no purer representation of the principles of geometry than the Pyramid of Cheops. But this is not quite as pure and essential, but in terms of the explicitness of its teaching, it has a lot more stuff going on. We have in here just a couple of things. We have two towers, which you can't see on this particular slide, but the larger, more ornate one is a solar tower with a big solar orb at the top. And this is a lunar tower and has a lunar crescent at the top. And the idea there is that there is a duality to the cosmic forces, that one cosmic force is represented by the moon and one by the sun. And in Chartres Cathedral, the idea is that the cathedral is actually, its roots penetrate deep into the earth. There's actually a well, it's referred to as the Celtic well. It's very ancient, that pre-existed the cathedral itself. That well was a place of pilgrimage. And the well is located at the confluence of several underground watercourses. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Guy Underwood. To my recollection, he doused this and said there was actually 7 streams that converged at that well, which is under the cathedral. There's some interesting things going on. There's the vault inside, and the height of the vault above the paving stones of the floor is the same distance as the depth of the water table. And I think that there's a reason for that, not just coincidence. But the idea of the cathedral is a textbook in stone. It teaches us about the principles of the ancient Hermetic science, whose origins was in Egypt and probably beyond. But it also is an instrument for the accumulation of cosmic power, for the fusion of cosmic power drawn down from above with the telluric current that's drawn up from below. And the materials used, the geometries of the chambers inside and so forth are absolutely crucial to the completion of the alchemy within the body of the cathedral itself. As we approach the cathedral, this is the so-called portal of judgment where you enter, and it's very symbolical. All of these represent scenes out of the book of Revelations, apocalypsis in the Greek. If we zoom in a little closer, we see the seated figure of Jesus, and some of you may now recognize the particular geometric form that he's in. We just were introduced to that over here. You see that? He's seated within a Vesica. Surrounding the Vesica are four creatures. We have a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel. What do those four figures represent? They are the fixed signs in astrology: Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And why the eagle for Scorpio? Well, Scorpio, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Scorpio is considered to be a dual sign with two aspects to it. Astronomically, if you were to go out and watch Scorpio rising, just to its north would be Aquila, the eagle, rising at the same time. And so Aquila, the eagle, became a counterpart to stand in for Scorpio. Yeah, just as Bill said, these are the four fixed signs of the zodiac. And if you could actually go at any one time and see all four of the fixed signs, there would form a great cosmic cross, because they're at right angles to each other. These four fixed signs were considered to be crucial in understanding the cycles of time. This is actually an emblem of the great year. And in this context, the four fixed signs represent the four seasons of the great year. Each of those seasons is 1/4 of that cycle of 26,000 years. Now, we use the number 26,000, which is rounded off. We don't know precisely what that number is. Astronomers have actually measured the rate of precession, the rate at which Earth is swinging around like this. Based upon that rate, it's actually going to be a little less than 26,000. However, we don't know that the rate is necessarily going to be constant through a full cycle. We don't know that the full cycle is completely or perfectly circular. If it's somewhat elliptical, then of course the rate is not going to be constant at any given time. There will be an average duration, but we don't know that the movement will be equal to that average at any given interval of time. The sacred number, the traditional number associated with this cycle, was always this number right here. 25,920 years. Now you can see that's very close to 26,000 years. So given the accuracy with which we know this information, it's perfectly correct to say that the precessional cycle is 26,000 years. However, in traditional concepts, 25,920 was the number always. We find this number affiliated or associated with the great year in Vedic writings, in Sumerian stuff. Now, if we divide this number by 12, like this, to get the length of a Platonic month, we divide 12 into this and we discover it's this number, 2,160 years. Now, 2,160 years is the average duration of an age. You know, we were in the age of Aries, then we went into the age of Pisces, and we are now passing into the age of Aquarius. Now, what that means is that if we could go out and actually, on the moment or the morning of spring equinox, on the day that night and day, when the period of darkness and the period of light are going to be equal to one another, we go out that morning, we look to the east, and we watch the sunrise. Okay, what's going to happen is we watch what we're going to see on the eastern horizon now, just prior to sunrise, is the constellation, the star pattern of Aquarius. If we went out 2,000 years ago and watched that sunrise on the morning of spring equinox, we would have seen Pisces in the eastern sky. But due to the precessional or the westward motion of the position of the sun at the moment of equinox, we no longer can see the stars of Pisces because they're behind the sun. And over the course of the next 2,000 years, the position of the sun will be slowly drifting through the star pattern of Aquarius. Now, when we talk about the constellations, they are not of equal increments. Those are the constellations. The signs get their names from the constellations. They are equal increments. If we take the full cycle, we divide it by 12, each of those is then going to be 2,160 years. That gives us the average duration of a Platonic month or an astrological age, 2,160 years. So if we go back halfway through the cycle ago, half of this number here would be 12,960. Okay, what would have happened if we went back 12,960 years ago and we were going to watch sunrise? What we would have seen in the eastern sky just prior to it disappearing within the light of the rising sun would be the constellation of Leo. Right? Now that was a very critical time in the recent history of the Earth, and that's what we're going to be talking about a lot this afternoon, is what actually happened during that age of Leo. Because it was during the age of Leo when the last great global catastrophe occurred. And I'm trying to understand that, see, when we get into catastrophism, what we have to realize is that there's catastrophism in the ancient concepts, there's catastrophism as it's now emerging in the modern revival of catastrophism, as contrasted with the worldview that was pretty much inculcated into our consciousness when we were being educated, which was the Uniformitarian worldview, which basically said the way things are now is the way things always have been. Or the way things have arrived, the way things are now have arrived at the way they are now only through a long, long succession of very small incremental changes whose cumulative effect is to create the world as we see it now. But in any given lifespan or any given period of several millennium, whatever, the Earth does not appreciably change. And that's kind of what we were taught, or at least that was what was implied in the worldview that was described to us. The worldview that prevailed through most of the 20th century, and only in the last 2 decades of the 20th century was it actually challenged to any extent. And now, of course, that worldview has completely collapsed, although the implications of the collapse of the old Uniformitarian worldview have not filtered down yet to mass consciousness, nor have they filtered down to academia as a whole, nor have they filtered down to the political leadership of this planet at this time. But getting back to this, what we see here is a model of the great year. And we see Christ seated with what we now know as the Vesica, surrounded by 4 figures that represent the 4 seasons of the great year. Now, to get to the 4 seasons of the great year stand to our annual year just exactly as our 4 seasons do, the spring, summer, winter, and fall. So we take this number right here and we divide it by 4, and we get 6,480 years as an average duration for each season. So we get 6,480, we get 2 of those, which gives us 12,960, and double that gives us the 25,920. All of these, as it turns out, are sacred numbers and recur over and over again in various traditional systems. They also occur in astronomy as well, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. The Vesica is also referred to as the mystic almond. And there are several quotes from the Bible that refer us directly to that image that we saw was inspired by this particular quote out of the 4th chapter of Revelation. After this I looked, and behold, a door, that's the Vesica, the door, was opened in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet, talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will shew thee things which must be hereafter. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat upon the throne. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, the second a calf, the third had the face of a man, and the 4th beast like a flying eagle. Now, don't let anybody tell you there's not astrology in the Bible, because if you know how to recognize it, it's all over the place. Here's another version of it. If you travel around Europe, you'll discover there are dozens and dozens of representations of this Christ within the mystic almond. And here again you see the four figures here representing the four seasons of the great year. Now, as it turns out, modern scientific studies have seemed to suggest that there is in fact a climate cycle that's very closely attuned to these four seasons of the great year. And in this afternoon's part of the lecture, that's what we're going to get into. You see that the figure of the master within the Vesica was not limited to just to Christianity. And here you can see the same figure, basically, that I drew over there on the paper. We see the two circles interpenetrating. Putting this into words, we see that what we've got here is one circle falls upon the center of its partner, and vice versa. So essentially what we've got here is this line, horizontal axis, is divided into three equal parts. This part here, the line of centers of the two circles, is equal to the radii of both circles. This is the cover of the Chalice Well in Glastonbury. What chalice would that be referring to there? The what? Ah. So what was the Holy Grail? Or what is the Holy Grail? What is it?
Feminine power.
Well, yes. In a very general sense, yes. Now, in a more specific sense, the feminine power. Yeah. Well, we might have time to get to some of that today.
The cup Christ used in the Last Supper.
Yes, that's one in the work of Chrétien de Troyes. It was described as the chalice that was used by Christ at the Last Supper. And then what subsequently happened to the chalice? What was introduced into the chalice? The blood, yeah. That's kind of on everybody's mind lately with the Da Vinci Code and all of that. Which is cool because, I mean, I think it's introducing a lot of people to some of these ideas, but, in reality, he doesn't really go very deep with it. So it's part of the whole process now of bringing some of this information to a wider audience, I think.
Yes.
I think that's its function. Of course, I should have written that book 25 years ago, but I was doing other things at the time. Okay, so yes, the Chalice Well, that refers us to the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is really a very profound mystery. It's one of those, like all occult symbols, it's in its complexity that it has its power. The Holy Grail is a multifaceted symbol. And like I said, we may get some time to talk about that this afternoon. I've got a whole thing I've put together on the Grail. Yes, Marty?
Is it possible that the Holy Grail is actually the center of the toroidal movement, that cup-like shape that opens at the top and the bottom?
I think that could very well be. I mean, that's like I said, I think it's a very multifaceted symbol. I have certain aspects that I've looked at. That to me could be a new angle to appreciate it. But yeah, because of the you're saying almost like the cup-like. Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. What she's talking about is the a gravitational singularity causing a warping of space-time, which in all of the way that those are depicted by astronomers and physicists and so forth, it has that shape to it, which we associate with the Grail. I've actually got some figures of Grails and looking at the geometry, and it's very interesting, very interesting. And I do not claim to have finally exhausted the meaning of the Grail. I don't think anybody ever will. Here is the Zodiacal wheel. And we see the 12 figures, and here you can see, here are the 4 fixed signs forming this great cross in space. And this afternoon we're going to look at this with periods of time associated with it and sort of what was going on during some of these periods of time. we essentially are right now, our vernal equinox essentially is in line with this right here. So 12,960 years ago, or roughly 13,000 years ago, the vernal equinox was here, coming up onto the cusp of Leo. And then over the next 2,000 years, the vernal equinox was passing through the constellation of Leo. And then it emerged into Cancer, Gemini, then Taurus. Taurus, you can see, was essentially one season ago, which from here, if we back up 6,480 years, we're right here. And that's basically where we see the origin of all the ancient bull cults that were then replaced by the worship, I use the word loosely, of the ram right here. And then, of course, at the beginning of the Christian era, we had the appearance of the fishes, appropriate to the Piscean age. Okay, I'm going to actually skip some of this because the whole program I've got here takes about 4 or 5 hours, so we're only going to look at a portion of it. This is an interesting figure. Since it's there, I'll pull it up. This is known as the Minutum Mundum, or Tree of Life. It actually, in the geometry classes that I do, we draw this, and then we actually color it and fill it in with all of its associated symbolism. But from here, if we could draw an arc centered right here, there's one half of the Vesica, and here's the other half. So this width to that length is that width to that length. So that's an important first clue in unlocking the meaning of this, the inner meaning of this symbolism here, is noting that that mystic almond is what gives its shape to this particular figure. Okay. In Masonic geometry, there are two systems used primarily, the ad triangulum system and ad quadratum system, meaning of the triangle and of the square. And they both start with this figure here. Because as I showed you, with this, by means of this figure, we can get both the right angle and we can get the 60-degree angle. We can get, see, the triangle is right here. Can you see, there's our triangle, and that gives us all of our angles based upon the triangle. And then we can actually create a square quite simply from this by going over here and creating a second Vesica like this. And then take my straight edge here like that, and then as the final step, I'm getting a little sloppy here, but I think you'll get the idea. I take the length of my square, which is one side length of the square now is generated by the length of the Vesica, and by going here and here, I can create, let me use a color here so it's a little bit more apparent. Now, if my intention here was only to create the square, all I need, like this is what in geometry you learn that you might lay out something here. This is a setup grid, and I don't need, wouldn't have needed to draw all the circles. All I need are the points of intersection, right? I need that line and 4 points of intersection, and I can generate my square. But you can see up here that from this one figure now I've created not only equilateral triangles, but I can create squares. There's actually a way I could create a pentagon, a hexagon. Seven-sided figure is interesting because in geometry there's no way of producing a perfect heptagon, which is the seven-sided figure. You can create perfect 3, perfect 4, perfect 5, perfect 6, perfect 8, but not perfect 7. And that has to do with some of the peculiar symbolical associations of the number 7. Anyways, there were two systems of Masonic geometry that were both generated out of the Vesica. The ad quadratum basically started with a square. There's a basic numerical relationship that pertains to the square, and it's the relationship between the square and its diagonal. And that's a very special relationship. If the side of the square is 1, the diagonal becomes the square root of 2, which is one of the mystic numbers that doesn't terminate or doesn't repeat. Likewise, in the Vesica, if we take the width as 1, the length becomes the square root of 3. So in terms of the Vesica, we have 1 to the square root of 3, and in the square we have 1 to the square root of 2. And this is the basis of the whole system of dynamic symmetry right here. It'd be too much to try to go into the specifics of that now, but when I do a sacred geometry class, what I do is everybody has a compass in hand, a pad of paper, and we draw. And by doing the drawings like they did back in the old Platonic academies or the Pythagorean lodges, that's the way you really get this comprehension of the geometry in your own mind, in your own consciousness, through hands-on.